Without further ado, it's my honor to be able to introduce the very first keynote address for the conference, entitled Evidence from Big Data and Machine Learning Regarding Transfusion Outcomes. And our speaker is the esteemed Dr. Kevin Trentino, who is a senior researcher at the Medical School, University of Western Australia in Perth. So Dr. Trentino is a postdoctoral health services researcher and a senior analyst supporting Western Australia hospitals and health service. His expertise in data and statistical methods to drive patient safety and quality, and his research has included patient blood management, digital health outcomes, clinical prediction models, and health economics. Kevin is also a member of the World Health Organization's expert working group for the implementation of patient blood management. Welcome, Dr. Trentino.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Becky. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'll share my slides, see if I can get this to work. Okay, can you see the slides clearly there?
Yep.
Fantastic. So I would like to thank Becky for that kind introduction. Also thank Professor Waters, Neil Blumberg, and Professor Soro, and obviously the BMSS 2024 Conference Committee for this invitation to present. So I'm going to talk on a topic which I think is very important and also very interesting and obviously highly relevant, and that is evidence from big data and machine learning regarding transfusion outcomes. And in doing so, what we're going to do is address the following questions. So the first question we're going to look at in this presentation is, what is big data? The second question we'll look at is, what do statistical and machine learning models teach us about transfusion outcomes? And the third question we'll look at is, what do we learn from RCTs, randomized control trials, and observational data regarding causation, specifically looking at transfusion outcomes? So let's go to our first question. What is big data? Well, we're witnessing a data revolution. And this was a headline back in 2017 from The Economist. And the headline read that the world's most valuable resource is no longer oil, but data. And it really emphasized how data has become crucial for driving innovation, informing decision-making across a variety of industries and sectors, but this is highly relevant to healthcare. And what it's fed is the growth of this new role, the data scientist. So the data scientist was previously someone who was unknown, maybe even non-existent. Now this is gone from being unknown. They've gone from being unknown to considered one of the sexiest jobs. So that's quite a big turnaround in a short period of time. And one buzzword from the data revolution is big data. I'm sure you hear the term being used frequently. But what actually is big data? It's actually surprisingly difficult to define. And it's one of those definitions that is context dependent, meaning you ask different people, they'll give you different answers. You ask over a period of time, and the definition evolves. So I'll attempt to give you what I think is a good definition of big data, and it involves what is commonly described as the 3 V's. So the first is volume. And I'm sure a lot of people, when they picture big data, they think of volume. So they think of lots and lots of data, enormous quantities of data. But there's other things to think about with big data. There's things like velocity. And what we're talking about with velocity is data that's created in real time, and maybe even data that comes at us at a far higher frequency than ever before. And then thirdly, we've got variety. So when we're talking about big data, we're talking about data that's structured in traditional ways, but also data that's semi-structured and unstructured. I'd like to go through these 3 points again, but use an example that I think will highlight it. And we're going to talk about the difference between large data and big data. So when we talk about large data, well, large data can be millions and millions of data points stored in structured databases. It can be updated frequently. It can even be live, and typically consists of numbers and text stored in rows and columns, and that's what we call tabular data. So large amount of data is not really big data, though we could say that big data is large. It's huge in volume. Let's talk about velocity, because velocity highlights quite a lot. So velocity, we're talking about high frequency data, and we're even more than ever before collecting data from things like sensors. So for example, we've got lots of patients that will walk around with heart rate monitors or fitness trackers. We think of patients connected to ECG monitors, and we're collecting data that's continuous, and it's recorded at very high velocity. So if you think, for example, of high frequency physiological data in the form of like waveforms, so with our ECG data, that's typically sampled at heart rates of, I don't know, 250 to 1,000 hertz. So when we're talking about that frequency, we're talking about 250 to 1,000 data points per second. And that can't be stored in traditional ways, as you can imagine. So you get a sense for what velocity means. When we're talking about a variety of data, we're talking about data that is typically structured, like our patient demographic data, diagnoses data, treatment data, our medication data that we store in that tabular form, rows and columns. But we're also talking about having unstructured data, like images from X-rays, MRIs, CT scans, which require specialized software for analysis, or even sensor data, as we've got in just the image above there in the middle. As we mentioned, that's high frequency data that comes in the form of waveforms. Or how do you store waveforms? You don't store those in traditional tabular databases like SQL databases. So I hope this gives you a feel for the difference between large data and big data. Now, there's surprisingly very little published in transfusion research or even transfusion avoidance on making use of big data. So this is an area where there's a big need. And I think we're going to see a lot of research come out in that space. I'm certainly excited with the work we're doing in our health service. We've got access to a lot of high frequency data, and we're starting to look at some of this. So I think we'll see lots of exciting research come out in that area, but at the moment there isn't a lot there. There's a lot published with huge volumes of data, and that's what I'll focus on in this presentation. So let's go on to our second question. What do statistical and machine learning models teach us about transfusion outcomes? But if okay with you, I think it'd be good if we take a step back and maybe ask a more simple question, like why do we even run models in the first place? Why are we running statistical or machine learning models? Well, the reason why we're running them is because we assume there's some relationship between an outcome, here given by the variable y, and other factors given by those variables of x, x1, x2 to xp. Now, I've included an image here of an excellent textbook if you're interested in more detailed information. But there are two main, in very basic terms, there are two main reasons why we wish to run these models. The first is prediction, or one of the reasons is prediction. Now, when we're running a prediction model, the y value represents whatever we're trying to predict, and that f, that function of x, really can be a black box in the sense that we're not typically concerned with what that looks like. We're not concerned with the exact form of it. We're really just interested in getting the most accurate prediction we can for the value y. Now, this is very common in machine learning studies, and much has been published on this. And so the examples I've put there at the bottom of the slide, you'll see two research papers there. These are examples that I've been involved with that use statistical and machine learning models to predict red cell transfusion. What these studies show is that red cell transfusion is fairly predictable, can be predicted with fairly good accuracy. Now, we're not going to focus on this, though, and the reason why we're not focusing on this is because we're keenly interested in what evidence from these large data studies teaches us about transfusion outcomes. And that's why the second reason why we run these models is so important. This is really what we're focusing on in this presentation. So with inference, we're interested in understanding the way that the y variable is affected by the values of x. We're wishing to get, our goal isn't to make a prediction as such. We're wishing to understand better the relationship between Y and all those variables that are associated with Y, those X variables. More specifically, we're trying to understand how Y changes as a function of our X1, X2 through to XP. And so we can't afford for that to be treated as a black box. We're trying to understand its exact form because we want to answer questions like which predictors are associated with the outcome, what is the relationship between the response and each variable in the model, how do these interact with each other, what are some of the mediator effects, and some of these questions. Now, this is very important when we're trying to answer the question, what is the relationship between red cell transfusion and patient outcomes? So let's focus in on that now. Bearing in mind, we're trying to look at large studies here that have been published. So back in 2013, Hopewell and colleagues published this systematic review. And these studies were comparing transfused to non-transfused patients over a 5-year period. Now, they specifically were looking at what they called large studies. Now, you've got to remember this was between 2006 and 2010. And a large study then was defined as 1,000 patients. So if come back to what we said, these definitions change over time, obviously. And they had, they pulled the results of 32 different studies. And what they found was a consistent adverse effect of red cell transfusion on mortality. This is data from 2006 to 2010. In trying to find updated data, we struggled a little bit. So we thought for this presentation, we would conduct our own updated review. So applying a methodology very similar to that 2013 study by Hopewell and colleagues, we looked at large studies examining transfusion and outcomes, but instead of going for studies with 1,000 patients, we decided to only include studies with over 10,000 patients. So now we're looking at 10 times the amount of the previous study. And we looked at the most recent 5-year period. Now, I'm not sure how much you can see from this table here. Hopefully it's large enough, but our search returned these 15 original research studies that were comparing red cell transfusion to no transfusion, specifically looking at mortality outcomes. The total number of patients included in these 15 studies was over 14 million, and the range of participants was between 12,000 and 10 million. You can see the populations that it was drawn from: cardiac surgery, lung transplant, hip fracture, upper GI bleeding, intracerebral hemorrhage, neonatal surgery. Importantly, we sort of identified 3 different types of studies. The first were, and these were the majority of them, were your transfusion versus no transfusion study. The second type of study that we identified here were the ones that were looking at 1 unit of red cells compared to no red cells. And the third type of study were what we call dose escalation comparisons. Now, if we cut to the chase and get straight to the forest plot in this review that we conducted specifically for this presentation, starting with our general studies, this was the largest group. These were studies that were comparing patients receiving red cell transfusion to patients that were not transfused. And as you can see from our forest plot here, we get a very similar picture to what Hopewell and colleagues described in their 2013 review. So if you remember their conclusion, they found a consistent adverse effect of transfusion with mortality. Well, 10 years later, what are we saying here? Well, if you look at our forest plot, you can see that each of the studies identified, these large studies with 10,000 patients or more, each of these studies identified that red cell transfusion was associated with increased odds of mortality, every one of them. So our results here between the studies that were pooled are consistent. Hopewell and colleagues' 2013 study, their results between the studies were consistent. So I guess 10 years later, we could say that we have consistency, which is remarkable. And we can touch on why consistency is so important later on. Now, they did make a comment, though, Hopewell and colleagues in their 2013 paper, and it was a however type comment that they were saying makes the interpretation challenging. And that was, they were saying that there are confounding factors in these observational studies that mean patients who receive blood are generally sicker than those who don't. It's very hard to, and this is a statement that's commonly made. I'm sure you've read this many times in the literature. It's very hard to put a definition on what sicker actually means and how that changes between patient groups. But that's why these next group of studies are so important. So this is the second group of studies we found in our review. And those are studies comparing a single unit of red cells to patients receiving no transfusion at all. These studies are obviously very informative because it is reasonable to conclude that patients who receive 1 unit of red cells during their entire hospitalization, they're more likely to be receiving a discretionary, potentially avoidable transfusion. And we could also say that the patient is less likely to be sicker. So in this study here conducted, you can see on the screen, conducted between 2010 and 2019, there was an analysis of over 2 million adult patients undergoing isolated CABG or isolated valve replacement. Over 2 million, of which 400,000 were included in the propensity score matched analysis. And these propensity score matched analysis, these techniques are designed to replicate the way controlled trials work. And in these 400,000 patients, in that comparison, they found that there was a 1.45 times increased risk of operative mortality in patients receiving a single unit of red cells when compared to patients who were not transfused. So that's just one example. There were other papers like that. Now, we'll also look at dose-response relationship. This was the third type of study in our review that we identified. And these are studies that are looking at that dose-response relationship between the number of units of red cells given and mortality. So the first large study we're looking at here on the screen, this comes from the National Health Insurance Database of South Korea. And it looked at patients undergoing their first open heart surgery procedure between 2002 and 2019. And we've got over 75,000 patients in this. Now, when comparing patients receiving 0 units to those receiving 1, 2, or 3 or more units of red cells respectively, they found increasing adjusted hazard ratios for mortality. Another similar study was conducted on US patients, and this one extracted over 750,000 patients from the Society of Thoracic Surgeons Adult Cardiac Surgery database. Now, this was in patients undergoing isolated CABG procedures. And they used slightly different groupings than the previous study for red cells, but very similar results. We could say that when comparing patients receiving no red cells to patients receiving 1, 2, 3, or 4 or more, there was an increase in the adjusted hazard ratios for death again. So we see that same pattern. And so what we see are, again, consistent results, and we're seeing a dose escalation relationship. So that's a very quick summary of what we can learn from very large studies looking at red cell transfusion and outcomes. These are studies with over 10,000 or more patients published in the last 5 years. How do we piece this all together, though? So our third question, what can we learn from randomized control trials and observational data regarding causation? So everything we've looked at until now is these large studies, typically these big data or large data studies are with observational data. And randomized control trials are considered the gold standard in research. And I'm sure you are also aware that many consider randomized control trials are the only way to establish causation. That's a view that many have. So it is appropriate to have a look at, well, what do randomized control trials show? And are they consistent with the results of these large data studies? Well, we conducted, some time back, we conducted an overview of systematic reviews. So just to be clear, this isn't a systematic review and meta-analysis. This is a systematic review of systematic reviews that were pooling randomized control trials. We searched, as you can imagine, we searched multiple databases for these systematic reviews and meta-analyses, specifically of randomized control trials that were comparing mortality in patients assigned to red cell transfusion strategies based on their hemoglobin thresholds. And this was over a 10-year period. Now, among other things, what we found were 68 unique randomized control trials. There's a lot of randomized control trials comparing two transfusion strategies. And these were pulled by 19 systematic reviews. And just to get straight to the point, I'll show our forest plot here of the results. The conclusion from combining all of this data from all of these randomized control trials and systematic reviews and meta-analyses that were pulling all these randomized control trials is that these meta-analyses indicate that in most patient populations, there really is no difference in mortality between patients assigned to a restrictive or to a liberal transfusion strategy. If you want to get more specific, more accurate, 75% of the meta-analyses showed no difference. 25%, so a quarter, showed that there was lower mortality in patients assigned a restrictive strategy. Now, here's a key point from this presentation. This may appear to contradict the results from these large observational data studies which have been showing till now, which have consistently showed increased mortality with patients receiving red cell transfusions. And as a result, some have incorrectly interpreted this to mean that, well, transfusion is not associated with harm because these large studies are just overestimating the relationship. Now, this, to highlight this point, this figure we have on the screen, this was published in the Canadian Journal of Anesthesia. And here, this article tries to describe what they feel is a discrepancy between the results of observational studies, which are in blue, and randomized control trials in red. I believe in this specific example, they were looking at cardiac surgery studies. Now, what this shows, if you look at the difference between the blue bars and the red bars on the forest plot there, what it's showing is that observational studies consistently find higher mortality and morbidity in patients transfused. They're the blue bars. Randomized control trials don't. They're the red bars. What's the reason for this? Well, the authors suggest that this discrepancy may be due to the fact that observational studies are associated with possible confounding, whereas randomized control trials have minimal confounding. Now, I'm using this as an example, but there are plenty of examples in the literature and probably down the hallways of your hospital too, where the reason given for the difference between observational studies and randomized control trials is that observational studies are prone to confounding and they overestimate. Now, that blanket assumption is incorrect. Let's explain why. Here's a Cochrane, this is from the Cochrane Library. And if anyone knows what the Cochrane Library represents, we can understand why this is so significant. And this was comparing randomized control trials to observational studies. So if we go back to the example we looked at just earlier with, well, actually, before we do that, let's have a look at what this study actually did. Now, this review, pulled 2,800 plus randomized control trials with nearly 4 million participants and compared those to nearly 4,000 observational studies with nearly 20 million participants. And look at what they concluded. They concluded that there was no difference or a very small difference between the results from randomized control trials and observational studies. They also say these findings are largely consistent with findings from recently published research. And in fact, this isn't the first time a large study like this has been done. This has been consistently shown for some time. There's even a series of articles in the New England Journal of Medicine from 2000, that's 24 years ago, saying the same thing. There's no difference or very small difference between the results of observational studies and RCTs when the methods are the same. What do they go on to say? And this is very important. Factors other than study design need to be considered when exploring the reasons for a lack of agreement between the results of RCTs and observational studies. Now, this is very insightful, such as the differences in the population, intervention, comparator, and outcomes. So let's go back to our Canadian example, and let's see if they've perhaps missed something here. And I would suggest the authors have missed a key point that we've just highlighted from that huge Cochrane review, and many more have warned against it. And that is, we shouldn't be basing the perceived discrepancy between those blue bars and red bars on the fact that one of those comes from observational studies and one of those comes from randomized control trials, when we've completely forgot to consider that there's a difference in the intervention and comparator. They're investigating two very different things. It's like comparing, you could say, I don't know, apples and oranges. So let's just pretend that our restrictive versus liberal randomized control trials are apples on the left, and these large observational studies we've considered till now are the oranges on the right. Well, one's asking if it's safe to use lower hemoglobin thresholds for transfusions. The other is asking what are the outcomes associated with transfusion. The intervention and the comparator between these studies are completely different. In fact, you notice the oranges are comparing 100% transfusion rate to a 0% transfusion rate. So that intervention and comparator is completely different to a randomized control trial looking at triggering a transfusion at a higher hemoglobin versus a lower hemoglobin. So we wouldn't expect these results to be similar. Just to highlight the big implications of what we're talking about here. Some questions simply cannot be answered by a randomized control trial. And when those questions cannot be answered by a randomized control trial, the highest level of evidence we have available are well-conducted observational studies. And the results of that Cochrane review highlight that when we have a well-conducted observational study, well, we would expect those results to be similar to a randomized control trial. So the implications are important. So let's put this in historical context. I'm not sure if you're aware of Sir Austin Bradford Hill. So he has been credited with the first published randomized control trial in medicine. It appeared in 1948. It was looking at streptomycin for the treatment of tuberculosis. Many might be aware of this, that he was a very well-regarded statistician who designed the clinical trial and really credited with conceiving the modern randomized control trial that is a mainstay of research today. Now, let's be clear, no one denies that randomized control trials, when well conducted, have strengths. They also have their limitations. And this is where observational studies are particularly valuable. To repeat the point, when a research question cannot be answered by a traditional randomized control trial, some classic examples are smoking versus non-smoking, which applies very well to Bradford Hill. So he conducted the first randomized control trial with streptomycin, as we said, but later on in the 50s, he was involved in those large observational studies, which determined the relationship between smoking and lung cancer. They couldn't conduct a randomized control trial. They conducted a series of observational studies, and they were able to establish causation. So questions like, what effect does transfusion have on outcomes? The best evidence we're going to find is going to come from well-conducted observational studies. And here's an excellent study, an excellent publication. It's from 2011, but it just amazes me how ahead of their time they were in publishing. This is published by Isbister and colleagues, and many of these authors here you'll recognize. These authors that have published a lot in this space, and they've applied the Bradford-Hill criteria for establishing causation from observational data to the adverse effects of blood transfusion outcomes. So this really highlights the valuable role and contribution that observational studies, these large data studies, and we're going to get into more of these big data studies. This highlights the implications that these studies have for helping us to draw robust conclusions from our data. So this is an excellent article, and I'm sure you'll enjoy reading it. So just to wrap up what we've looked at in this presentation. First of all, the first point that a key point to take away is that big data is more than large data. Sure, big data does involve large volumes of data, but it involves a lot more. It involves things like data that comes from sensors at very high frequencies, and it involves unstructured data like waveforms and that kind of things that we're not collecting, that we can't store in traditional SQL databases. There isn't a lot published in the transfusion space using big data, but we can really sense the floodgates are about to open. So get ready to see more publications in that space. The data we have from very large data studies have really highlighted that transfusion is associated with adverse events. And this is our second conclusion here, that statistical models and our machine learning models on large data are consistent about the adverse effects associated with transfusion. They've produced consistent results for many years now. And our third point is that, as we've looked at using the example of the Bradford-Hill and the Bradford-Hill criteria, that data from large observational studies should not be underestimated. And they are going to be very important in assessing the relationship between transfusion and outcomes. And thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it.